Hello Dungeon Masters and Players, welcome, and this is DM Dango with another review from the DM's Guild. Today I'm going to be looking at Heroes of the Plains, a nice little set of campaign starters, class options, racial options, and a few little bits and pieces on lore and interesting mechanical things that you can add to your D&D campaign. This one is a little bit more for DMs and players in that they gives you a lot of different class options. Looking at the start, there's a lot of little tiny things that make this a very interesting piece of literature for your DM campaign. There's some interesting starts for campaigns and how to run them. Notes on how to do a plane, multiversal plane-based campaign. How to start them, how to build them, and what things you should be thinking about, and kind of how things like, oh, you're a long way from home, you're banished to the far-flung, say you're banished to the fire, the elemental plane of fire, and you need to find your way home, or maybe the Feywild, or somewhere like the Astral Sea. Or maybe even you've started out in somewhere like Eberron and you've ended up, somewhere in the Forgotten Realms. Both are possible, and it's rather interesting to think that you, as a character and a player, the best thing you to do is, if you were long from home, is to be banished, to find some cleric somewhere who could banish you. But maybe the banishment spell doesn't work, or has problems, or due to the very nature of the banishment spell, nobody can find anything that's particularly distasteful to you. That's one of the prime things about the banishment spell that I think DMs tend to forget. The material component section in it, normally we ignore it, because for the most part, it's fine. If any material component that you have that doesn't have a gold cost must have some kind of, you ignore. You can use your spell focus, or you can use your material components pouch. In the case of banishment, though, I think it's worth keeping it in, because the specific for banishment spell must be an item of distaste. The item must be something like, for instance, if you were trying to banish an angel, you need to have something like brimstone or obsidian, something hellscaped. Conversely, for a demon, angel wings, angel feathers, angel tears, something from the elemental planes of Elysium, where it kind of makes sense for you to have this item, you to research the creature you're trying to banish and then banish them. With humans and, the more normal player races, it's a little harder to work out what you would use to banish them specifically. Humans, by their very nature, are very chaotic in terms of what they find distasteful. Some find, for instance, humans find pineapple distasteful on pizza, but others love it. So there's nothing specific for any group of humans that can say, yes, all these humans hate this thing. No. There's no way to know until you research that specific human. So banishment in of itself is quite balanced, although it is mentioned a few times in this document that there might be some problems with the banishment spell if you were playing a race, for instance, the Genasi, who are naturally elemental affinities, so a water Genasi, a bucket of fire or something similar, or hot coals would be distasteful to them, and they would shirk away from it, and that could be your banishment banishment focus. And if you're from one of those planes, being banished is quite bad, splitting the party. So there are rules to kind of mitigate this problem, but I think for the most part, banishment mitigates itself due to that material component. Enemies are very rarely going to be researching, at the lower levels at least, you specifically to banish you. It's rare that those two Venn diagrams cross. An enemy both with the ability to banish somebody and one who's waiting to research you. Most part, for the first, say, 1 to 7 to 8 levels, your enemies aren't going to know who you are, and they're not going to be capable of casting the banishment spell. So I don't think that's as much of a problem as the author makes out to be. Moving on from those points, we have the racial options. They're the next section to go into. And my God, there are there are some really great pieces of lore in this, and great pieces of little tiny snippets of things, and it's clear that the author has been around Dungeons and Dragons quite a long time, or at least been aware of it, to know the various ins and outs. And he references certain materials as well, going back all the way to, I believe, 2nd edition. The first up is the Briar, which are a Centauris-like race, but instead of horse, more goat. And they're an interesting concept, although I do think there's a point where there's a slight typo where it says chaotic, where it says lawful, when I think they probably should be chaotic. But that's neither here nor there. There are interesting things around them. Because they're a quadruped in a similar way to Centaur, they would have problems with things like stealth and ladders and things like that. And it's a way of adding flavor to them. It gives a nice feel to them. They also have things like the Gith and the Githrazi, and they're split into 2. And it's interesting because I like, whenever I see an option in a race option that is interesting and unique, or is not just some derivative of something like a tiefling, a warlock, tiefling, a half-orc, or some other of the normal races, I'll go, ooh, that's a good idea. And the Gith have one of these things where they have both a naturally psionic bit to them, and I think that you could pull that out and create its own feat by itself. But there are other things like, if the Githrazi, which is one of the variants, they roll a 20 on their initiative score, normally that doesn't mean anything beyond you're probably going first. With the Githrazi, it means they get the ready action the first round of combat, which is huge and gives a big benefit for having that initiative. But at the same time, I think it's quite balanced. And in actual fact, all the races feel fairly balanced against their normal player race counterparts. This doesn't feel like some, DM, homebrew, crazy, overpowered Goku syndrome. This is definitely very well balanced. These are definitely very well balanced races, and I love that. I love to see that somebody's taken the time to work out, is this balanced? They've taken the time to run through the numbers and run through playtesting to go, yeah, okay, this is actually balanced. The other racial option that I really love, one of my favorites, is the Rogue Modron. It is a beautiful concept. It has been done before with things like the Borg and Hugh from the Star Trek Next Generation series, but it's interesting to see how it would play out in a more machine-based organism rather than one that is specifically both organic and machine. To give you some examples, when the Modron are a group of little tiny clockwork creations or mechanical creations that essentially all exist as a hive mind, a lot like the Borg and other similar concepts. But in the case of a rogue one, the rogue has individuality, and to them that's abhorrent. So obviously all the other Modrons attack them. But then if the Modron escapes, as a player would have to in order to become a player character, they have interesting ways of doing things. Their logic is a little flawed because by their nature they are rogue and thus not perfectly logical. They do things like assume that the weather is related to why somebody is angry or the previous day's weather. But they also do things like the proximity to music must make people drunk, not the alcohol they're imbibing, and the other little logical leaps. It gives a lot of good hooks for people who are trying to RP these and saying, well, these are some things you can try. A lot like how in some of with the Kenku, it says the Kenku cannot speak normally, they mimic. And that's a really cool RP element you can really leverage as a player, and I really love that. And I love the fact that they went into enough detail to say, here are some rogue Modron names. And in fact, everything in here feels like it was taking the time to think about how this would show up in an official Dungeons & Dragons book. And in the fact of the matter is it looks like that. There are, for instance, Homebrewery lets you do a lot of this kind of formatting. It lets you build these. And it's a really good way of doing it. And it really shows, and it really builds a lot of this looks official, this looks proper, and it gives the confidence as a DM and a player to say, yeah, I can use this without feeling like I'm using a homebrew. And that's huge, and DMs feel more comfortable allowing these options in. For my games, I would have no problems with these. In fact, I'm even thinking about introducing a rogue Modron as an NPC, because I think it's a really interesting story in of itself. For my players, if you're watching this, it might happen, it might not. But moving on, you have other even more subtle things called the plane touched, which are little bits and pieces where characters and races that already exist have been touched slightly, or have interesting origin stories, like the Risen Azamar, which are divas who got kind of annoyed with the fact that every so often an Azamar would fail, and then they went, no, we can do this better, and so descended into the mortal planes as Azamar, with slightly more powers, obviously, or maybe Aarakocra, who have lived on the elemental plane of air and know its workings and ins and outs. Or there's the Chanad, the bastardization of a Sladi who has survived the impregnation process. So if you don't know what the Sladi do, they inject creatures with their eggs and they burst out of them once they're, mature. But if somebody survives that, they become a Chanad. And they are unpredictable, unrestrained, and horrible creations at this point, and hate everything. And obviously, there's one other race or option, which is the Eladrin, which are elves that stayed on the elemental plane, the Feywild, basically. They stayed there and decided, no, we will not mingle with the mortal races. We're going to ascend to kind of royalty. They're like the royal elves, as it were. And then there's the Genocide who live on their own elemental planes as well, so earth, air, fire, and water. And they have different abilities because of that. But then there are things like the humans who have lived in the Shadowfell, and they've become warped and broken in a way. They seek emotion and pain, and they seek experiences that would give them something to feel, because they have muted sensations. They don't feel as they normally would. And these little RP elements make these races better. They give them depth, they give them interest, and they give players something to grab onto and leverage as a role player. And I love that as a DM who focuses on role play. So, top points there. Moving along, you have then the class options. 3, in fact. Druid, Rogue, and Wizard. The first one is the Planar Druids, or more specifically, the Circle of Planar Seals. And they're all about making sure that nothing from the Far Realms gets in. Now, the Far Realms are where things like Cthulhu and the Illithid and other horrific things come from. These are things that are both alien and dangerous. And I've never seen an ability where wild shape charges were used for anything other than just wild shape. And it's nice to see that they've gone, well, a druid in this circle wouldn't necessarily use their wild shape like this, but they need to power something, and so they use it to power banishment, which thematically is brilliant. They get it at the same level, and it still uses, you still require the same componentry in terms of, I need this thing, I need to research this thing to find out what I need to banish them, but it means that you don't have to waste those spell slots on banishment, that it could just fail. And I like that idea. I like the idea of using existing spell pools or resource points to reuse things that are more thematically fitting. And then there's the Rogue. I love the idea of this one, the Gatecrasher. I go in, I fuck portals up, and that's what I do. Because why not? Because that's what a rogue would do, who is a planar traveler. He travels through portals and figures out how the portals work. He doesn't necessarily know how to build his own, but he does know how to mess with them. Things like popping people to horrible imprisoned places, the ability to change the destination to a random location. So if somebody's, you're watching somebody go through this portal in and out all day, you just change it to a random destination and poof, they go out. Or even injuring people as they go through this portal. And I love that little thing. And I love the fact that they can kind of hijack other creatures' teleportation and jump to it. It's interesting mechanically. And I think, on the whole, most of these are balanced. And in fact, I think all of them are balanced. I misspoke there. The final one is the Wizard, the Plane Shifter, a person who understands the forces that underpin the cosmos, as it's said in their description. Understanding that all wizards draw, when they cast a fireball, they draw from the elemental plane of fire and use that. And the way they do certain things, like being able to stabilize a plane. So say you're on the elemental plane of fire and taking fire damage and taking exhaustion like you normally would, the wizard can pull his strengths together and create a bubble of safety for them. A safety for him and his party so they can rest comfortably. And I love the idea of that kind of wizard, the one who, I understand how the planes work, but I'm going to make this one mine. And they even go even farther and say they can create their own little demi-planes where they can hide and be safe. And of course they get bonus spells along with this. They get almost all the teleport spells along with the more extra planar things. Leomund's Hut, Mordenkainen's Mansion, those kinds of spells that allow you to create tiny little pockets of universes that you control. Now, all in all, the Heroes of the Planes is a beautifully crafted, well thought out addition to the DM's Guild. And I love it. I love every single little bit. I love the lore callbacks to the various bits and pieces. I love the interesting abilities, things like the Gizrazi that I mentioned. I love the roleplay elements from every single thing, both class, race, and the campaign starters. There are nice references back to older editions and where you can pick up more of this stuff. Am I going to use this in my campaign? Yeah. Like I said before, I'm probably going to include that rogue mod run. I'm probably even going to include some of the rulings around, and I would probably allow my players to use any of the subclass options should any of their characters die. And they're headed into Chult, so that's probably likely. Now, in terms of the campaign starter stuff, probably not going to use it, but it's got me thinking about things I could do should the need arise, should they do something dumb with, say, a bag of holding. But in terms of my rating overall, this is a very, very well put together document. At $2.99 on the DM's Guild, it's really great value in terms of what you're getting out of it. If you just wanted the race options or just the class options by themselves, I could see you paying for those by themselves. But getting everything together is a really great way of saying you want to run a Planes type or multiverse type campaign. Here is what you need to get started. It gives you hints on where to go next, but it gives you a good starting point. And I think for a lot of DMs, that's where they struggle. It's that beginning starting point to understand, I've got an idea, kind of, but I don't really know where to go. I want to run this multiversal campaign because I like sliders, for instance. I remember the old, 90s show about jumping between dimensions, and I really like that idea, trying to get home and jumping from plane to plane. But I don't know where to go. I don't know how to get started. I don't know what the rules should be. So this would help them. In terms of my rating, though, final thoughts. I think it's 5 out of 5 for this guy. It is so well done that I cannot fault it, even for the small grammatical errors that I did find and the weirdness on the Briar. It's minor and overlooked. This is easily a 5 out of 5 for me. Now, please remember to like, subscribe, and ring the bell if you want to see more of my content. I'm hoping next time to do, in light of Critical Role going live for their second season, I'm hoping to do a review of the Blood Hunter. I know other people have done reviews of that one before, but it feels appropriate given the timing. Thank you. This is DM Dango. Peace out.